Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. Homeschooling is not actually a real word, but rather slang for the concept of home education. And home education is the education of children being educated at home. Imagine that, typically by parents or sometimes tutors. And rather than in the formal institutional type settings such as public or private school. However, just as there are many different methods of education within public and private schools, it is not different at all in in a home education scenario. So from some people strictly read books, others use more like hands-on kind of classroom style type teaching. Some people are unschooled, which means there is no curriculum. There's all these different ways of home education. And this diversity does make it difficult to analyze the psychosocial impacts of home education. But anecdotally, I have often assumed homeschooling to be problematic, but have struggled to point my finger on why. And that's why I invited Chris onto the show to figure it all out. How you doing, Chris?
Fantastic. How are you doing, John?
Oh, I hate myself. No, I'm doing absolutely.
There it is.
I'm doing okay. No, I've been actually doing pretty good. We usually me and Chris like catch up on the day that we're recording this, and we didn't really. So now I'm like, oh, I want to tell you all these things, but we're gonna stay focused on the task at hand. First off, Chris, you and I were both homeschooled, but how long were you homeschooled?
I was homeschooled from kindergarten through 10th grade. And then my junior and senior years of high school, I attended a local community college doing a running start program where you could achieve high school and college credit at the same time. So other than those 2 years, my entire childhood was homeschooling.
Gotcha. What was your curriculum like?
A little bit of a hodgepodge. It kind of transitioned over the years. And then as I got older, we incorporated a lot more outside different materials through the homeschooling co-op that we were a part of. So we used a curriculum called Abeka when I was younger.
Oh no, you were a victim of
You're
Abeka.
familiar. You're familiar. Abeka produced by Pensacola Christian College. Which if you know anything about Pensacola Christian College, that can tell you a lot. The main curriculum we used for to kind of build a structure and create our foundation as far as our schooling went was called Sunlight curriculum, which was more of a literature based curriculum, and that actually was really. There were issues for sure, and there's aspects of it that may have been problematic, but I actually really did appreciate it. It was great for me, being really into reading and story. It was very interesting and a great way for me to engage with a lot of interesting topics. And then we incorporated, after we stopped using the Abeka curriculums, we brought in a couple of other different ones that we discovered through other homeschooling families. So our math was one specific thing. Our English and all that stuff was coming through the Sunlight curriculum. And then starting in middle school, mainly, that's when my quote unquote real classes, my real subjects were starting to be taught by other homeschooling moms rather than my own. So then we were. It was this much more almost college style thing where we would pick out a class that was needed for, at least in Washington, it was needed for your high school diploma, you'd be taught along with a handful of other students by a teacher who is just a different homeschooled mom who was maybe better equipped or more familiar with the topic, so that my mom, who was not very good at math, wasn't teaching me algebra. And then I was learning Spanish from somebody who like spoke Spanish, things like that.
Gotcha. And you kind of were describing it a little bit, but just for the, if the listener does not know much about like homeschooling or homeschool culture,
Mhm.
can you kind of broadly explain what a co-op is, and then maybe talk about
Yeah,
how you interacted with a co-op?
yeah. So broadly speaking, I mean, as I kind of mentioned, the homeschooling, and I used the word moms. There were a couple of dads, but it was broadly speaking just mostly homeschool moms, a couple of stay-at-home dads. Um, they all worked together. They basically create like a very loose coalition of families that act almost like a private school in some ways. And for me, like we had 5 different periods. Each period was an hour long, and then like you would have all these different classes you would choose from for each year. Um, and you would uh, as a younger kid, it might just be like supplemental things. You might take this little class here or there that was about like it might have been about a book club, or we had like the cooking classes and a chess club and things like that. It was much more geared towards like extracurricular learning usually, and socialization. And then as you got older, then it became more about the education side of things. Then you have your math, your science, your history, your literature, all those different kind of language, those kinds of things. And instead of, like I said before, like instead of being taught by one of your parents, um, you would be taught by the parents of other students, other kids who were also homeschooling in your community. They would all work together, and it was run, by had a set of bylaws, and was run by like a board of like five. I think it was 5 women the whole time I was there, who basically would set some parameters and like structure for the whole organization. It was very, for me and a lot of the people I knew, a lot of the homeschoolers I knew, it was central to our homeschooling education experience. Um, I know families that did not have any connection with a co-op or anything like that. But for me and most of the peers that I was close to, it was at least a significant part of their education, if not like the main central focus of it by the time they were teenagers.
Awesome. Cool. I want to kind of contrast your story with mine because I think it's rather interesting.
Yeah.
So for me, growing up, yeah, when I was really young, we just had some basic books. Always had like Bible class, and the way it was set up for me was my high school diploma reads Christian Liberty Academy. But Christian Liberty Academy is not a physical place. So Christian Liberty Academy, which is based in Illinois, it's almost like distance learning in college, where they send you a list of books or courses, depending on how you want to look at it, and you go through it and pick what you want to study with it that would qualify for the credit, so to speak, right? So for
Yeah.
me, it was like a list, and my parents were great. My dad did most of the supervising at home. Some of it was teaching, but a lot of it was supervising. Um, and so, I would basically pick my curriculum off of this list. Um, but since it was Christian Liberty Academy, there was obviously a Bible category. Um, so there was Bible, math, English, yada yada, the rest of it. So I'm one of the few cases around me that didn't go to co-ops. A lot of my friends who were homeschooled did go to co-ops. And I think what you were describing, especially with like the fact that there were bylaws and stuff, is pretty typical. There's usually like a institutional structure to it. For me, when I got to high school, all that happened was basically I had more selection about what I was able to study in any given field. The philosophy being that if I'm part of choosing my education, I'm going to learn more, which I think was absolutely true. Here's the tricky part. Algebra is kind of hard to learn on your own. So, what I did for algebra was there were like CDs. Um, I feel like I'm an old man now. There were CDs that you'd put in your desktop computer. uh, and wait for it to buffer. And then you would watch, and basically it was just like someone with basically like a digital chalkboard who taught me algebra, just like one guy who like went through Saxon algebra with me.
Oh, was it
Um,
Saxon?
yeah.
Yeah,
And
I did
so
that too.
yeah. And so you and I
Yeah.
probably have a few crossovers too. You mentioned Abeka. So thankfully, the only Abeka I ever did was like some grammar books when I was younger. So like there wasn't too much indoctrination in those. There was some, but not too much. But yeah, a lot of my curriculum was either Christian Liberty Press, which is like basically this whole organization that, encourages Christian homeschooling. Um, but yeah, so my daily schedule looked very different than I think a lot of people's. Mine, I kind of woke up whenever I wanted to. I did what I needed to do that day, in each workbook. And then if there was anything else to do, I really just Googled stuff. I mean, like straight up, especially as I got older, obviously, and was using a computer more. A lot of times, if there were like questions in the workbook, instead of just going back and doing the work, I would Google it. Now, some people might say, oh, that's cheating or taking a shortcut, but it's really not, because I learned the information just as well as anyone else would. Um, at least that's my perception, but who knows? Anyways, that's kind of my growing up homeschooled. So just to get a little more specific, how much, to your recollection, maybe through the years, how much did you write versus read? How much math do you feel like you did, and what was your kind of daily schedule like, or how did that daily schedule maybe change as you got older?
Mm, yeah. Writing versus reading. There was a ton of reading because I was really into reading. And it was a huge part of the curriculum that we used, like I mentioned before. So, um, I mean, when I was younger, there was a lot of the reading was like read aloud stuff that my mom would read to all three of us kids. So we were in different age ranges, um, and there were read alouds, and then there were more grade specific things they would use to flesh those out. And then as I got older, that part phased out, and it just became reading for myself. So literally, there was like a literature, there was history, there was language arts. A lot of that involved just reading. Um, Writing, as I got older, obviously it became more of a thing. It was not a significant part at the beginning, and I hated it. I would fight constantly back against writing in any form. I hated handwriting practice when I was really little. I hated trying to be creative and doing creative writing or any of those kinds of things until I discovered typing. Handwriting was just painful for me. I never got I never got a grip on how to hold a pencil, and I always, even to this day, when I have to write a lot, it hurts my hand because I'm not good at it. And I have bad handwriting, which never got better. But typing, once I figured out how to type, opened a whole new world, and I started getting really excited about writing. I liked it a lot. So I think it was probably middle to late middle school that I really started getting excited about that, and using a computer for most of my writing and things like that. And then I really flourished and like learned a lot more about writing at that point. Um, Math was I hated it always. I just am not a huge fan of math. Um, and it took up probably the majority of, or what felt like the majority of my time, because I hated it so much and I didn't have the best resources for it. It became kind of this thing that would consume my time, um, and I would spend way more time on it than was scheduled or expected or whatever. Um, but yeah, my daily schedule that evolved quite a bit over the years. When I was little, I mean, it was pretty dang structured. My mom was very much our teacher. I mean, she had a degree in early childhood education, so I think she was really excited about it, and it was exactly what she had like learned about years before in college. And then as we got older, I started to have to do more of it all on my own. We became more, each child had more specialized things. The older they got, the more the grades diverged, whatever. So it started basically, I mean, I felt like we were usually done with school by like lunchtime, 12:30, 11 o'clock. And then the rest of the day was just kind of like I could just do what I want, play outside, read books, play games, whatever. And as I got older, obviously my day started filling up. I would have more to do. And then once I was in, I mean, it probably started in middle school, really, like eighth grade at least. But by the time I was in high school, especially, I was responsible for my own schedule. I had my all these different things I needed to do, different classes, and it really was homework. Because of how Central Co-op became, I had class once a week. It became the majority of my schooling was homework, and not just in the like sarcastic way you could say, well, all schooling is homeschool or homework when you're homeschooling. It became like you would go to a class, you'd have an hour, you talk about whatever, and then you had this huge stack of homework that you would take home and you'd have to work on, which meant that I learned procrastination. So my schedule became whatever I wanted it to be, which was usually reading, and then all the things I hated on Sunday night right before it was due. Um, so that was a real blast. I did have some all-nighters when I was in high school because of that. I had a lot of what a lot of freshmen and sophomores experience in college. I experienced as a freshman and sophomore in high school. So that was fun. Um, but yeah, by the flexibility side of things meant that some days I might do a lot of school and other days I would do practically none. It just depended on what the family schedule looked like, what my personal schedule looked like, and what I wanted to do to some extent, the more freedom I got as I got older.
Yeah. All of that sounds fairly, especially once you start getting in the later years, sounds somewhat comparable to me as well. One of the things, just quickly, you mentioned like spending all that time on math. I think I've told you this before. My biggest problem with math is I could tell people the answer, but I couldn't tell them how I got it. And
Yeah.
so like I would get very frustrated because I could solve something, especially if it was a pretty simple, equation, and then they'd like be like, show your work, and I'm like, I can't. And they're like, well, my dad would be like, why can't you show your work on this? I'm like, I don't know how I got there. It was one of those weird things where like I could almost get it was like my brain catching up with itself or something. Like I could get the
Yeah.
concept when I learned it, but I couldn't tell you the concept or something. um so I hated math, especially when I would like send my tests in, because that was the other part of the curriculum I used. So my dad didn't actually grade anything. It got sent to the place. He would mail it back and they would give the grades.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which is good. It eliminates the like parent bias or whatever. And I mean, he would give me grade on like practice tests or whatever, but on the things that counted, he did not grade it. And then talking about just, so yeah, you can learn procrastination. You can have those days where you like do nothing and those days where you do everything. My procrastination looked like having to have a few extensions through the summer, never because I like didn't do anything, just because I had a few things I didn't do, because I didn't want to do it. And that's how John works. He doesn't want to do something, he just doesn't. But eventually I obviously graduated and it's all good. But yeah, I feel like it was like, even though I learned procrastination, I felt like I also learned responsibility in some ways. I never had an all-nighter. That kind of blows my mind. I definitely I was done by 1 p.m. most days, whether I was done or not. As I got older, I was like, it's 1, I'm done. Did I wake up at 10? Yes, but I don't care. I'm done. But I don't feel like that made me suffer too much. But I want to get into the academic side of this discussion a little bit more later. The main concern that I normally hear in regard to like homeschooling is not an academic concern. It's that children will not properly develop socially due to a lack of interaction with same age peers. Um, but what's funny is, I did a project on homeschooling when I was in college, and some of the stuff I learned follows. When homeschooled children are evaluated for social interaction, self-concept, self-esteem, and leadership skills, they typically score above the norm. And it's not typically these students kind of the image of them huddled over worksheets and textbooks over the kitchen table. Like, sure, that's part of it, but they're also taking part in activities outside the home, whether it be co-ops or homeschool groups or whatever. They take field trips, they join church youth groups, they play on sports teams, they do volunteer work. Some of them have jobs. And homeschoolers themselves tend to agree that home education has brought their family members closer. My question for you in light of this data is, do you think there's like a delayed sense of rebellion or even a pursuit of identity in homeschoolers?
Hmm. Yes. Sometimes at least. I would say there's a couple weird things about the socialization thing and the data. Um, when I was researching this, just kind of trying to brush up on some things because it's been a while now. I I kept finding reports and surveys talking about socialization, the majority of which were published by organizations in support of homeschooling. So that kind of tweaks the data a little bit, and I had a harder time knowing how accurate and well performed those studies were. That said, like I also know like there are also a good handful of quote unquote well adjusted homeschoolers, and you to survive kind of have to learn some aspects of like social skills, and the other thing talking about self concept and self esteem. Um, I kind of wonder if there's like a self selection thing going on there too. It doesn't really surprise me a ton that that's the case because on average, I think it's pretty safe to say that most homeschooling families come from, well, they're families that are much, much more likely to be intact nuclear families than you would find at the average public or even private school. And you're also going to find parents who are very invested in their children and their children's education. Um, who I think you could argue if they were attending a public or even a private school, the parents would probably be still just as invested in their children's learning, education, well-being, and that would still probably impact that child's success and that child's self-esteem, self-concept, um, ability to engage with the world, those kinds of things. I think there's a part of that is a family dynamic thing. Part of it's the actual experience that they have based on their education style. But the family dynamic thing, I think, is actually really important to keep in mind during these conversations, just because I think that your chances of finding a public schooled a child in a public school environment who has the same um, average uh, family structure as someone in a homeschooling environment are pretty low. Your chances of having the same are unlikely because on average, the resources needed to homeschool your children are only available to certain types of people. Um, so there's that side of things. Now, that said, your actual question was about kind of a delayed sense of identity and maybe some rebellion. Um, and I have seen that. I think it obviously varies dramatically, but on an anecdotal level, I've seen it happen many, many times that you'll have kids raised in a fairly uniform environment where they're taught a certain way of looking at the world and raised to believe certain things. And through homeschooling, they aren't really exposed to much outside of that except through carefully controlled exposure. And so once they're on their own and they're out in the world and able to kind of make their own decisions, you see some homeschooled alumni really go quote unquote off the deep end. You'll see people who get really into drugs and alcohol, or you'll see kids just like decide that they're going to like throw out everything that they were taught as a kid about religion or faith, and they decide that all of it is BS, and they don't want to hold to any of that anymore. So there were plenty of examples of that. Sometimes they were used as a warning for me as a kid, like look at this is what happens. Sometimes you got to watch out for this. You don't want to be like one of these guys. But yeah, I would see that fairly frequently, and I guess in some ways I experienced it myself. It took years. There was a huge delay before I started rejecting a lot of the things that I was taught and believed, and started to maybe question um, a large portion of what I was taught or how I was educated or brought up. A lot of those things. It took me a long time before I started really kind of digging into that and picking it apart. So I guess to answer your question, yes, and it depends on a lot of factors.
Sure. There was a lot of good stuff you said in there. One of the first things I do want to address about how a lot of studies are clearly done by like pro homeschooling groups. That's totally a problem, especially if you like only do like, cursory work, like your first few pages of Google or whatever. Like that's going to be a lot of what you're looking at.
Oh
I
yeah,
will say where it gets interesting is if you look from different educators' perspectives. So there's people who have like, taught in public school versus like homeschooling their kids. There's people who have, taught in a co-op, taught in private, taught in public. It's very interesting to hear what they have to say, at least anecdotally. But yeah, some of the surveys can seem a little bit like geared. And one of the funniest things, kind of self fulfilling prophecies about these studies, is homeschoolers are good at taking tests. So when they're
yep,
given a survey, they usually know the answer that's being looked for. And yeah, so that's just kind of a funny little side note. But yeah, I definitely think there is kind of a delayed sense of rebellion and maybe a delayed sense of pursuit of identity, even if it happens younger. I mean, because your family is more intertwined in your life, you were kind of saying, like, especially if it's like a typical nuclear family setup in a homeschool environment, like when they're that intertwined with your education, like it almost feels like your whole world is your family, even if you're not like the most buddy buddy with your family or whatever. Still, you're growing up with this like cognitive understanding that like of the world being what your family thinks and not so much
absolutely.
any outsider perspective. So I think that does do some damage there in the delaying. I will say that like the studies that I've looked at, some more valid than others for sure, but when I've looked at them, it seems like there's significant mental health benefits and few consequences of home education. And one of the things I was thinking about is like how, social media, not alone, but it's definitely an integral part of this world that we're creating, where the definition of friend is being redefined and kind of separate from the real world, like um and all the negative psychosocial effects and other factors are not necessarily on any particular educational system socially, in my opinion. Like it doesn't seem to be directly causing a harmful environment, but that might be the actual problem, because if most home education is done badly, which is hard to measure, then that's a problem, but it's hard to measure. And
Hmm.
whereas public and private, there's certain things set in place, some good things, some bad things set in place to measure how good that education is done. That's a little harder to do on a home education level, and perhaps that is why many have suspicion of the method of home education as a whole, and they don't necessarily take things case by case. But what do you think? Do you think it's more common to be socialized improperly at home than public and private schooling?
Oh man, the socialization thing is so weird for me. Partly because I have like two very conflicting feelings. There's the feeling I had as a kid, which was very proud and resentful. That I hated when anyone would bring it up, kid or adult. It always made me angry. I had all the answers and defenses and all these examples I could point to, like, oh, all the homeschoolers I know are super normal. Things I would say really defensively. We're perfectly capable of being social, and actually we're smarter. We're whatever. There was this really like us versus them attitude that I had, and so I would compare myself to public schoolers, and I always was had this superior mindset. And there's still a little bit of that when people talk about homeschoolers and homeschooling. I know that there's a lot of misconceptions and assumptions that people will make. Um, that said, I also, on the other hand, with some hindsight, also realized that when I was in puberty and trying to figure out how to make friends, I had no idea. Um, And that is something that varies dramatically. It's going to be very specific to individual families or people within individual families. Um, but for me, homeschooling didn't equip me to learn how to interact with new or different people. I had a very isolated social environment. I was exposed to the same kinds of people and the same people usually most of the time. And so getting to know new people and learning how to make friends was not something that I really got as well as I wish I had. Now, again, I can't know what I would have been like in public school. I probably would have been an odd one out and a weirdo then too. So there's, again, you can't know without like having access to an alternate universe. You can't know and compare directly. But I, on one hand, know that my own social awkwardness and difficulties and insecurities, a lot of which are based around my social exposure as a kid, I have that on one hand, and then I also just have a lot of anecdotal. I got a lot of anecdotal evidence as well of students, homeschool students, who were very much not socially or exposed to society in a way that was constructive or helpful to them. I guess I I knew a lot of different homeschool families who usually were outside of our homeschool co-op, but sometimes a part of it, who were just bizarre, very odd. And again, that's coming from within the little tiny homeschool subculture that was already weird from an outsider's perspective. We were like, what the heck? Like, these are weird, strange, odd people saying weird, strange, odd things. You'd have people who just had no idea how to have a conversation, people who would not stop talking, who were incapable of listening. They only would like just talk at you. All these different kinds of things. And it was something that you would see not just in like one kid who was a little odd or whatever, but it would be like a whole family of kids who had similar characteristics. And that side of things, like whenever I think of homeschooling, I have immediately this like combined thought of like these so-called well-adjusted, like smart, really engaged, socially engaged students, and then these others who were socially isolated, really bad at communicating with different people, and continued to be outsiders and viewed as weird or odd into their adulthood. Um, and I know that I also engaged with people like that who were, college students who had graduated and had already they'd been homeschooled their whole lives. And when we were in college, I remember sometimes talking to people who were at our Bible college who were still kind of like this, and it always threw me off. It always was just really weird. And I remember as a kid being kind of um, uncomfortable and afraid of them, not just because they were odd or different, but because I was afraid of being like them. And I was terrified that I was going to be perceived as being like them to those who were not homeschooled. So whenever I was in public school dominant cultural groups, I guess. So, I mean, maybe like even my youth group at my church, there weren't a lot of homeschoolers at the church I attended. Or later on when I was older, um, and I was in different kinds of social groups, I was constantly afraid of looking like one of these really weird homeschool kids to all these so-called normal kids, I guess. So yeah, I don't know if that completely really kind of touches on what you were looking for there, but those are some of the thoughts that come to mind for me.
I'm not looking for anything, Chris. I'm just here. Are you okay? Do you feel safe? No.
No, no, I don't.
No, I thought you did well. So you're kind of talking about like um yeah, this image in your head. One of the things you said more than once, and I actually like thought that was such a good simple way of putting it, which is weird and odd. So like there's always going to be a weird or odd kid in a public school or a private school, right? And like
For
there's going to
sure.
be outliers or whatever. What's weird about homeschooling is it almost feels like built in, like and like we're supposed to treat the weird ones as normal, which in some ways it's like, oh, that's kind of progressive. Oh, that's kind of
Yeah.
cool to like be inclusive of people who talk and act different from you. Perhaps the scary thing though, and we're going to talk more about this later, just like the abuse that can happen in homeschooling, but like I
Hmm.
think what's really tricky about it is, yeah, if you grow up with your only authority figure being like your dad or mom, and then there's all these other authorities in life that we have to interact with, negatively or positively. But if your only institutionalized overseer is your family, then Tim Hawkins used to have a joke. He'd be like, are there any homeschoolers out there in the audience at his comedy shows? And then he'd go, what's it like to be outside? And like that is kind of like that is kind of, it's a very funny joke, but like the reason it's funny is because you kind of do see these kids who are always just kind of looking up and looking at trees and looking at clouds and looking at people like, what is this? And that's where it's like, okay, so if you're not developing socially but you're developing in every other way, you're going to be aware that you're behind. And that
Yes.
awareness of being behind is obviously probably going to contribute to some anxiety, to some narcissism, to some like, other mental health issues.
I was going to say something that I think maybe really contributed for me was that I was in a state of almost constant culture shock, which is a way of describing it that I literally have not thought of until just now. Um, but a lot of the like social anxiety and insecurity came, I wasn't socially anxious around people who I considered my peers. I wasn't really freaked out to be around other homeschoolers until I was a little older and insecurity had really gone out of control because of being a teenager. Um, but the culture shock side of things, that was just like constant. If I was around people who weren't from my little tiny subculture, I was constantly aware that I had no idea what was going on, that I had no idea what people were talking about. I could pick up on the fact that people were referencing things and never know what they were talking about. And I was afraid always to let on that I didn't know because I didn't want to seem like an outsider or a weirdo. But then what happens is you don't actually know how to engage with what people are saying. So then you are an outsider anyway. And yeah, like you said, like that self awareness side of things, when you're developing at the same pace with everything else, or even faster sometimes with everything else, but socially or even culturally, you're not at the same place, you're going to be hyper aware. And that's its own special kind of torment.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely want to get more into this a little later, but I do want to just take some time to focus on the academic side just a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Um, because there is a common stereotype that like home educated students are academic, like especially I remember at churches, like people would be like, oh, you're homeschooled, you must be in 12th grade, and they'd be talking to like a 7-year old or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the joke, and it is true that like homeschooled students fare 15 to 30 percentile points higher on standardized achievement tests, which I'm not a big fan of standardized tests. I could do a whole episode on how I think they're terrible. But if you're looking for a measure, that is a significant number that they're scoring higher than their peers in public school settings. To be fair, that's not compared to private school. That's only compared to public school. But still, um, scoring a good bit higher on standard achievement tests. However, it is true that many students who are homeschooled do actually have trouble gaining entrance into the best colleges and universities.
Hmm.
Best meaning most highly reputable. Again, it's so hard for me to talk about education without wanting to just deconstruct higher education as a whole. But we won't go
As
there
we
for now.
should.
Yeah, I'll leave some other podcast to all of that mess. But the reason for the kids having trouble, I would say most of the time is not actually home education's fault. And there's been like in the past like 20 years a lot of work done to try to fix this problem to make it a little more fair for home education students who want to like go to reputable colleges.
Yeah.
But home education is not fraud. There are laws, at least in the United States, in regard to home education. And so it's not like a get out of jail or get out of school free card for students or parents. It does take like hard work, determination, and an incredible amount of self discipline in students, especially if you're homeschooled when you're in high school. Um,
Yeah.
do you, just for you personally, do you think home education helped you in any academic sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it definitely did. Whether or not it was, miserable, the pattern I had in high school of, class on Monday, try to do homework throughout the week, and then realize you didn't really manage your time well, and then you do it all at the last minute. Um, Navigating through that and learning from it um, was what prepared me then to find, attending that community college in high school. Uh, that was easier for me. Community college was an easier time, easier experience than my first 2 years of high school, which then led to those two things. I went to Bible college. I found it way less overwhelming and way less intense than I would have otherwise, because I had already been doing a lot of this stuff. I'd already been given syllabus or syllabi at the beginning of a school year. I had been, used to receiving school materials and a structured schedule and being like, all right, this is what's going to be due this week or for this class. At this point, this project or paper or whatever will be due. And learning how to manage time in order to figure out how to get those things done. Homeschooling for me, or the way that I was homeschooled, really prepared me for that. That said, also, because I am and was really into reading even as a little kid, um, my homeschooling experience and the curriculum I was given as a homeschool kid, it all really worked well for me. I learned a lot, and then I continued to learn outside of the prescribed curriculum. I would check out books from the library, science and history books, just for fun. I was a nerd as a little kid, and I loved reading for the sake of reading, and homeschooling really encouraged and allowed me to explore that. So yeah, I mean, my love of learning, my interest in learning new things, my ability to learn by reading, all of those things were really encouraged and fostered by my homeschooling education experience. So for me, yeah, that was definitely helpful. Um,
Yeah, I would chime in and just say like, yeah, like the reading comprehension definitely, when you're in an environment where not only do you read for school, but you get to read for fun, and it still is fun. It's not like forced or structured or weird programs I've seen in public schools where it's like read 100 books and you'll get a pizza, and I'm like 100 books, like what? Like I'm like, part of me is going, that's a lot in a summer, and part of me is going, also I probably had a summer where I read like close to that, and no one had to tell me it
you
because
just did it.
I liked reading, and it's like it sounds like when an adult says that, it sounds like they're just trying to trick you into homework. But yeah, so the reading comprehension, one of the things I used to say all the time is like one of the benefits of homeschooling is you learn how to learn. um which is like a very shorthand, unnuanced thing to say, but what I mean by it is truly like, yeah, the time management, the ability to go to a library and like read something more you're curious about. I think curiosity is fostered pretty well in a home environment because well, one, you're kind of relaxed since you're at home and you're more, I don't know, it doesn't feel like you're clocking in at work, right? So like if something comes up in school, like it feels more like, okay, well, now I'm just thinking about that. I'm not thinking about that because I'm at school.
Yeah.
So it almost kind of blurs those lines. I think that can be helpful. However, there's always got to be a negative side, right? So there are many examples of kids being educated in the home in order to be told falsehoods, such as lost cause propaganda, creationism, and other demonstrably untrue narratives. I know, hot take. But I don't know. are the, when this does happen, this probably happened in homeschooling a lot more before Google. Are the few instances of these tragedies of, and I don't mean just like little influences of some falsehoods. I mean like full on. There's been stories of homeschoolers thinking the South won the war. So I'm talking about like kind of extreme stuff. And some postmoderns might say, well, in some ways it did, but
I
go
was just
away.
gonna make that joke.
Yeah. But I don't know, are the few instances, or many, but I think probably less common rather than more common, of the tragedy of being really falsely educated on something so obviously demonstrably false, is that as harmful now that Google exists? What's your take on that?
Well, I haven't been a homeschooler for well over a decade now, so I don't know exactly what it's like now. I mean, the entire time I was old enough to use the internet, Google was a thing. Um, so for me, like I was raised in you know, I came of age in the era of the internet, and I had my exposure to the internet limited until I was a like older teenager, and even then, what I was permitted to do, whether I was, I could have probably gotten away with a lot more than I actually tried, but what I was permitted access to was actually pretty limited, compared to the average teenager. So for me, like I can't speak to what it's like as a homeschooled kid now, um, but even when I was a kid and had full access to the internet, the things that I was taught and encouraged to read, and the things that the people around me believed and were taught and encouraged to learn, were often very, very out there, strange. Um, there were a lot of, and this is where things really started to intersect with the church, with the evangelicalism, and often the most conservative branches of evangelicalism come to light in homeschooled worlds. So I was exposed to all these different ideas and beliefs, some of which even as a kid I was like, that seems weird or wrong, but a lot of which I took as normal, or if I wrestled with it, I wrestled with it because I felt like I didn't agree with it, but I knew that it had to be true because I was being taught by certain people like this is what's true. um, so my I was given a little lost cause stuff, when it was like Civil War history and things like that. Certainly more than a normal Northerner would get, I think. So that is kind of funny. It's almost more amusing to me than anything. I mean, my exposure to conversations about race and things like that was mediocre, but that's probably true for a lot of Americans, even if they weren't homeschooled. When it came to more religious subjects, I was given full indoctrination. I was through my science, history, um, and in pursuit even of my, whatever was given to me as I pursued my own interests outside of, classwork. When it came to like things like history, science, archaeology, whatever, I was given a lot of information that was just straight up false. Some of it was things I learned later on. I was told and taught things that were completely fabricated and made up, evidence that was used to try to prove different things that, like, I was told, like, proved things from the Bible would be completely fabricated. Lots of young earth and creationist stuff. I was very, very into it. Very anti-evolution as a middle schooler and high schooler. Um, that was probably one of the biggest things. I was also exposed to a lot of weird beliefs about gender and gender roles. I was exposed to ideas that I didn't necessarily prescribe to, or my family didn't prescribe to. We knew people who were part of the Quiverful movement, which is basically
Woo! That is like Yeah, if you want to get into Christians calling other Christians cultist, start
Oh
looking
man,
into some of that. Yeah.
I knew many families with more than 7 kids, 7, 8, 10, 12. Weren't close friends with most of them, but there was an entire part of my social world that was connected with some very, very conservative homeschoolers. That's the side of homeschooling that even you know as a Christian, I was still calling them a cult. I would look back at them and be like, "Oh my gosh, this was cultish, behavior. They believed all these specific things." Um, but yeah, even in my own literature, even in things I was reading, which again, like my parents weren't reading all of these books before I was. They didn't necessarily know the content of everything, so I can't like fault a parent for all of this. But I was given stuff that was not necessarily going all in on something like that, but encouraging some of the same kind of ideas, about gender, sex, sexuality, all those types of things. Like as I got into high school, and of course you mentioned Bible classes, like Bible being a part of your schooling. That was definitely the case for me too. So as far as indoctrination goes, getting a nice healthy dose of indoctrination from a young age, and the older you get, the more you're reading. You being Presbyterian, I'm sure you had a great amount of reading from like the Westminster catechisms. um,
Ayo, I
yeah,
had at one point up to like I think up to like 50 of the first 50 shorter catechism questions memorized.
that's not disturbing at all.
Yeah, it's kind of
It's a
wild.
normal well-adjusted childhood
It's
right there.
normal. Yeah, I like how you said healthy dose of indoctrination. I was like, that's the most ironic sentence I think I've ever heard.
Oh yeah. Yeah, Westminster Shorter Catechism, baby. I remember reading that for school. And at no point was it, this was Bible. It was just Bible. That was the class that it was considered a part of, or the subject. Um, so, as a student, as a kid, you're reading these books, and it's not like you're in college being told, like, read these different books from different perspectives. That might have been the intention, but that is not how it was communicated to me. So for me, I'm reading these books to learn, not to like try to like think critically about where they're coming from, but just to learn. So you're reading books and going, wow, this is what this says. And I was like, wow, I had no idea that we were all predestined by God ahead of time to either burn in hell or go to heaven.
You're not taught that, like exactly what you're saying. It's not like you're taught that as a theory. You're taught that, and then at the same time, going to science class or picking up your science book that says, hey, gravity, and starts describing gravity, and there's no
Yes,
distinction between those two concepts.
my science textbooks were talking about hell and heaven. My biology textbook talked about sin. That I don't know if I could have summarized literally everything that we've been talking about for the last like 20 minutes. I could have probably just said that.
I mean, it really does kind of sum it up, doesn't it? And I just wanted to kind of wrap this section up, and then we're going to take a short break. I've talked to a lot of home educated students. I've probably met more home educated students than many have. And a lot of them hated the process, and some might even say they hated their parents, or hated certain grades when they were going through the process. But almost all of them who graduated told me, and that's a key element, who graduated. Um, they told me that they were glad that they were taught critical thinking. Um, and yeah, there seems to be some sort of higher success rate, whatever that means, among those educated at home than those educated publicly. Um, and there's negative consequences to home education, but they almost seem at first to be short-term problems. Whereas if you learn critical thinking skills, that's a long-term goal. Um, that's kind of how I want to wrap up the academic thing. I'm just more curious. I'm going to throw this question out there, and then we'll take a short break. Let's say you had limitless time, you had limitless money, you had limitless energy. Okay, would you prefer a child of your own to be publicly, privately, or home educated, or maybe some sort of combination? And of course, I'm not going to hold you to this. I'm just kind of curious what you think about it.
Man, right now I lean away from homeschooling. I think there's benefits to personalized education, and that's where homeschooling can be really successful. Um, but it requires a full commitment and a lot of resources that not everybody has. And like, my wife and I both work full time. I don't think either of us plan on ever not working full time. So neither of us would be able to give our children the attention needed for a good, healthy homeschooling experience. Like with unlimited money, you can afford a tutor, and that could potentially be useful. But a tutor can be useful when you're already attending a school. Um, for me, for a lot of honestly, for cultural reasons and social reasons, I would rather my child attend public school, um, and then have access to, in an ideal world, access to tutoring and things like that, in order to delve deeper. And of course, like that could change depending on how things go in the time between now and any time I might potentially have a kid who's going to school. Schools, public and private schools have, like you mentioned earlier, plenty of their own issues, and they can be infuriating and frustrating too. There's a ton of concerns that can come up. So, right now, because I don't have any kids, it's easy for me to just go, I don't know, I don't care. Um, but if I really had to decide right now, I mean, I think that attending a public school is probably the thing that would be the most likely scenario, if I were to have a kid that I was trying to figure out how to educate.
Yeah, I feel like I'd maybe fall pretty similar to you for probably pretty similar reasons. But just clarifying, is your reluctant? You said cultural is a big reason, because what you and I know would agree on is personalized education. That's a great way to put it. Is like, paying attention to what the child educational needs are. I'm sure you and I are big on that.
Hmm.
But there is something almost cultural you miss out on if you don't go to a physical building. And but yeah, so maybe just to press you a little harder, so we're talking unlimited money. So yeah, maybe a tutor. Are you still leaning more public than private? Are you going to be one of those parents whose
Yes.
kids in an expensive private school, or or
No.
what you thinking there?
No. This is again purely anecdotal, but I don't know a single. I didn't as a teenager, as I was getting to know more people through like, youth group and things like that, and then even in college, I don't really know anybody who attended private schools who liked or had a positive experience. Private school, I have a really negative association with private school. Um, and even my brother attended it like a private Christian school when he was in elementary school for a while, and I just remember just not liking it at all whenever we were participating with any of it. Um, so for me, that one's just kind of like, no. Um, I'd rather my kid attend a public school and then have access to you know additional resources as needed. In a perfect ideal world with unlimited money and I can do whatever I want, my kid gets to go to school, gets to have a public school education and grow up alongside their peers, but also has access to learning, additional or have assistance in learning, in any areas that maybe they struggle more.
Absolutely. All the more reason we need to work on public schools and make
Yep.
them, uh, you know, um, more robust and also have more access, like you're talking about. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and actually talk about Christianity. So that'll be great.
In a world full of toxic Christianity, one man has elected to change everything. What's his name? No, what's his name?
Oh, oh, okay. Yeah, I'm John Werner, son of Timothy Werner. That's my dad's real name.
God help the poor guy.
I'm just out here trying to tell people Christianity's a cult.
Yeah, he is. And he's even written a whole freaking book about it. And now you can read all about his opinions in The Cult of Christianity by John Werner.
Yeah, you should go buy my book, guys. It helps me buy Taco Bell. If the most common, around 36% of students, reason that parents give as the most important reason to home educate was a desire to provide religious or moral instruction, then wouldn't there be some sort of suppression of feminism? Well, Christian women that were homeschooled are often stereotyped as barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen kind of women, but that's not necessarily what the data shows. Adolescent girls constitute a population historically at risk for falling short of their full potential, as found in a study by Harvard. But home educated girls seem to find their voices and their identity. In interviews with teenage girls, it is found that when they're home educated, they actually feel empowered and they trust themselves and retain their self-confidence as they become adults. This is typically attributed, the positive trend of women finding confidence is attributed to the great difference between homeschooling and traditional schooling with regard to how relationships, roles, and expected behaviors go. However, there are certainly darker anecdotes. In a 2014 study of child torture, Barbara Knox, a pediatrician at the University of Wisconsin, found that 47% of school-age victims had been withdrawn from school for homeschooling. An additional 29% had never been enrolled in any kind of traditional school. Also, many horrible things have been connected to Bill Gothard and other religious communities. There was an anonymous girl who escaped from her home, and she was interviewed by the BBC, and she said, "My parents had heard about Bill Gothard, founder of the Institute of Basic Life Principles, abbreviated IBLP, who was a really big deal in Oregon. They attended his seminars and embraced the IBLP homeschooling curriculum wholeheartedly. There was a lot of heavy-handed smacking from our parents. To disobey them was to disobey God. The system was especially awful for the little ones. At Bill Gothard's seminars, he used to talk about breaking their will. They were quite abusive, but we knew other families who had it worse than us. When I was little, we lived in a mobile home. It was really inadequate. There were 4 or 5 of us in a room," end quote. Homeschooled children do not have the same daily contact with mandatory reporters as children who attend school. And because of this, homeschooling offers abusive parents a way to isolate their children and thereby conceal and intensify their maltreatment. More than abuse and neglect, many parents are not often educated themselves and further should not be the sole source of information a child receives as a kid. So, with all of that kind of there's this positive side where it seems like Christian women maybe counterintuitively seem to actually have more self-confidence if they were homeschooled. But then you also have these darker anecdotes of abuse. I'm just going to pose this question. Go wherever you want with it, Chris. Why do you think that so many evangelicals opt for home education?
I think that, the question kind of answers itself. Homeschooling provides the opportunity to control the information that is, if not entirely accessed, it certainly provides the ability to control the information that is given in the form of education. And that matters. That has a huge impact. If you want to make sure that your children don't get taught what you might consider heresy or dangerous or unhealthy, then homeschooling gives you the ability to homeschooling allows you to say, this is what my kids' history is going to be. This is what my kids' teaching about the beginning of the world will be. This is what my kids' teaching about what it means to be human will be. You can control all of it. You can begin exposing your child to your political preferences, not just at home, as any kid might get, but instead they're getting exposed to your political views potentially in the form of their education. And that has you very briefly touched on this earlier, has a lot of potential power. When a kid hears something, they may or may not believe it. But when a kid is taught something as part of their schooling, you know, and right before they learned that 2 plus 2 is 4, and then right afterwards they learned that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. How are they supposed to, learn and realize that maybe the things they're being taught, there are some that may be fact and some may be opinion. So evangelicals have this really great tool at their disposal now that homeschooling in the last few decades has become fairly accepted and is now legal. There's an opportunity to control what your children are exposed to. And if you believe that things like evolution are not just maybe incorrect, but are antithetical to your entire worldview, well, you can just keep your kid from being taught evolution, and you can teach them creationism, and only then expose them to the theory of evolution through your own perspective. If you think that your child shouldn't be taught um, that America is founded on white supremacist values, well, guess what? You can teach your child instead that it was founded on Christian values, that it was ordained by God, and that we should seek to move towards a government which more accurately reflects the teachings of the Bible. And you can teach that in your civics class to your child if you are homeschooling. You can't do that if if your kid is public school. You can tell them these things, but it's not going to have the same effect when it's coming from just their parent and not their teachers. If the parent and teacher are the same people, the amount of impact that what you say to your kid, the amount of impact it has on your kid goes up dramatically. So for me, I think if, especially as you start to see evangelicalism exhibiting cult aspects, then homeschooling suddenly becomes a very attractive tool to evangelicalism. The more a evangelical parent is a part of a more culty format of Christianity, the more they're going to find homeschooling attractive, because it encourages and it empowers their ability to control and contain their family members and their children specifically.
Control, contain, convert, baby. Got the branding in. I love it.
The
Yeah,
one
no,
downfall is the convert side of things, because homeschooling doesn't expose you to a lot of non-believers usually. So that part,
which is which is incredible in its own right, because you're still taught when you're homeschooled that you need to learn the best creationist arguments, the best blah blah blah, under some guise of conversion in
yeah, you got to
evangelicalism.
be able to argue people into heaven.
Yeah, it's truly wild. And yeah, I think you're totally right that, like, yeah, it it gives you, you can opt for a way to neglect education that will maybe be in tension with your worldview. And it's like, well, first off, proper education, and I know, again, we've mentioned this several times now, but public and private education have their own problems with this as well, especially in the US. But um you know you education requires more than just teaching opinion as fact. Like, it actually requires being able to understand differing opinions and critically think about all of them. And I think evangelicals say, no, that's too scary, because these evolutionists, or these government education systems, these liberal education systems, these whatever they're afraid of in the public or private sector, whatever they're afraid of, what they're doing is they're saying, I don't even want my child to entertain that idea. I don't want them to
Yes.
be convinced by that idea. So I'm going to protect them that's the worst word you could possibly use, especially when it seems that when you actually figure out what kids suffer the most abuse at home, they're kids who are not at school.
Yeah. Well, and you bring up this idea of protecting your kid. And it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Those kids that are going off the deep end and rebelling, maybe having a delayed teenage rebellion phase when they hit their late teens or early 20s, are oftentimes kids that were quote unquote protected. They were protected so heavily from the outside world that when they get out there and they discover what they've been isolated from, they may snap and get really angry and go, I'm rejecting everything because I now feel as though I was denied access to all of these things. And I always found it kind of ironic, even when I was still a homeschooler. I remember seeing it and being like, "Well, that's what happens when you isolate your kid." And then, I got older and then was like, "Well, looks like I was isolated too. Actually, I just didn't really realize it."
Yeah, and that's the most key word in all of this. I brought up earlier a lot of the positive aspects that a home education could give a child, but you know, isolation is not profitable for anyone. That it's not like we have a bunch of children monks, going into like some sort of spiritual isolation.
Oh, can you
Um,
imagine though?
I'm sure someone would try it. I'm sure it's been tried in history. But I think what's really important is to note that like it's not the education that's the problem. It's the isolation from ideas, the isolation from people, the isolation from ways of education, the isolation from, other adults.
Yeah,
One of the most important aspects I think that, in my research I found was just, it's kind of an obvious statement, but I didn't really comprehend it that like children who go to public and private schools are around a lot more mandatory reporters. So if they see
yes.
abuse, they have to report it. When you're at home, you're not around no mandatory reporter. In fact, you might be around the person abusing or neglecting you.
And I have read horror story after horror story of just that kind of thing happening. Homeschooling is very much a popular tool for certain types of very abusive parents. And you mentioned Bill Gothard and like the Institute for Basic Life Principles. I've read a lot about people in that particular strand of the homeschooling movement. And I was on the edge. I mean, when I had a homeschool graduation through my co-op, and I was literally gifted a book by Bill Gothard by one of the homeschool families. So I mean, this was right there in my world, even if I wasn't raised in it directly, thankfully. That specific strand of teaching and that brand of homeschooling is especially useful for abusive families because it teaches this whole idea of and almost like an umbrella concept, like an umbrella of authority, that a child is under the umbrella of their parents, the wife is under the umbrella of the husband, and the husband is under the umbrella of God, and that like chain of command, if you will, goes up to God, right? So as you mentioned, like disobeying your parent is disobeying God. And at the same time, those parents are being taught to physically abuse their children in order to break their spirit and force them to behave in a certain way and conform to a certain belief system. So if your kid is acting out or your kid is starting to argue and then talk back, well, you teach them to conform. Physically, violently teach them to conform. And then when they're older and they start to try to, you know, think for themselves, well, they've been taught not to do that. They have been taught literally not to think for themselves and not to talk for themselves. They're instead told to conform. Um, that is a very particular type of abusive homeschooling that exists, and it's not the story for everyone, or probably even most, but it is a very, very, way more common story than I am comfortable with.
Absolutely. And I certainly knew kids who grew up in this or under the Dr. Dobson philosophy, the focus on the family
Oh,
stuff. Like, and all of it's like pretty much, yeah, the umbrella that you mentioned is a very helpful tool for understanding how dark things can get. Because imagine, I don't know who's listening. Maybe you were homeschooled or maybe you were public schooled, but imagine that you're either like in class as a child, or maybe even at camp as a child or something like that. And you're having fun with your friends or whatever, but you're talking over the teacher. The teacher warns you a few times to stop talking, and then you're a kid, so you neglect it. Okay, now imagine that teacher pulls you aside, hits you, and then tells you that you were disobeying not only them but disobeying God. All of us find that very problematic. But that's kind of what happens in the home education system. And you're like, well, it's their parents. I'm like, yeah, but it's also their educator. And when those lines get blurred, it can really blur how you understand your education and how you
Yes.
understand your participation in your education. Um, and that can be really, really damaging later on and make people not trust themselves, make people, question sources based on faulty lines of thinking, questioning sources based on the premise, not the conclusion. Um, there's a lot of like really difficult things, and yeah, so I would say the biggest problem with home education, especially in evangelical circles, tends to be neglect before it's abuse. I think there's a lot of neglecting to teach certain things. I think there's neglect to socialization. I think there's a lot of neglect in some of these quiverful type environments you were saying, where you have 8 kids but they're poor, and so like there's just these horrible neglects that happen there. um and yeah, I just think that overall it's pretty tough. And I've actually heard like evangelicals kind of laughably try to like defend homeschooling as like biblical. So like I've heard scriptural arguments for home education that are based on very false assumptions. Like one argument I've heard is that Jesus was homeschooled. um and, and though it is true that all children are home educated till around age 5. I mean, not everyone thinks of it that way, but all kids are home educated till around age 5. But there is no biblical or extra biblical evidence to support Jesus was taught exclusively by his parents. In fact, most scholars I've read actually seem to think Jesus had at least some formal education at a synagogue school. But regardless of all that, should we even care about how people used to be educated back in Jesus's day?
No. No, literally. Why should we? This is a period of time. Like, why should we look at the past and say, well, they did it like this? This is how they raised kids in, 300 BC. So that's why we should do it now. This is how they raised kids in Jesus's day. What? This is how they, taught children in 1500. I don't care. In 1500, they were burning people at the stake because they disagreed on how to have communion. And in Jesus's day, like they were allowed to sell their kids into slavery. And in 300 BC, the Spartans were deciding to just like expose some of the weaker children to the elements and let them die. I don't really look to the past on how we should raise children, because the past, especially when it comes to children, the past is basically just like one long train of thousands of years of child abuse. There's not really like, children have been treated like garbage for most of history, and we're learning how much damage that does to children, to people. And I think we can have a lot better of a society if we, try to not damage children the whole time they're being raised. So for me, looking at the past is a very silly way to like stand up for any form of homeschooling or education in general. Just like, okay, well, classical education worked really well for these people. Great. All right. Well, how can we have something based on classical education that works well in a way that we know doesn't hurt or damage children? Well, homeschooling was great for this, that, and the other. Okay, well, great. We'll figure out how to do that in a way that's not going to destroy that kid. Um, I'm far less interested in what used to be done, and far more interested in what we can study now and use data to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Preach, Chris, preach. I'm in full agreement with you that learning from the past is great. What's not great is literally repeating the past over and over. In fact, that's kind of the point of learning about the past, is to not do that. So yeah, why can't we look forward? I mean, I know like public and private education systems are still very outdated, but even if home education was kind of the only education in, like, I don't know, pioneer days, like, who cares? Don't be a pilgrim. That's such a bad goal to try to like emulate. And I think this is a lot of the like silly rhetoric from evangelicals when it comes to homeschooling. um is this idea that somehow you're holier than thou if you homeschool, and it's just frankly not true.
It's really interesting. Like, anecdotally speaking, it feels like both the Puritans and the pioneers, like your Pilgrim settlers and your Western settlers, are both like kind of idolized in the homeschool community, and I think partly because both often were very involved in the home education. They were homeschooling their kids, and they're also considered cultural heroes by the people who homeschool their kids today, and I think that's kind of funny.
I also think it's some of the only people you can find that actually did it the same way that evangelicals try to do. Um, I think like they're like, we got to look for some sort of role models, and sometimes the only role models they can find are Puritans who behave like they did. Um, when a critical eye would not see them in the same light. I've seen some scary consequences of improper education in both public, private, and home education, right? Um, and there's never going to be a perfect type of education, or even education taught like in a perfect type of method. Um, but our education does impact us psychosocially. But it's not significantly affected by the location of our education. Each ultimately, feels like a cop out, but it's true. Each child is different and will have different educational needs. Is the bottom line.
For sure.
Um, all awkwardness aside, though, home education is probably not problematic as a practice, but all the problems I've ever had with homeschooling are problems I've had with Christianity.
Yes.
They have found a way to control, like you were saying, to have more control over people by either legally or illegally engaging in home education. So here's the kicker. Should white evangelicals in general be permitted legally to educate their children given their track record?
This feels like a trap. Uh, well, yeah. On a principled level, I would say yes. But if I were to go into more detail, I would say that it should be regulated more carefully. I don't necessarily think that all homeschool students should be subjected to Common Core curriculum requirements. I mean, a lot of people homeschool their kids specifically to escape the restrictive nature of the public school curriculums that they are dissatisfied with, and I think that's fine. Um, but I think that there should be some more stringent requirements. I on one hand, I'm just like disappointed with the amount of misinformation I was taught as fact as a kid. On the other hand, I literally knew a guy who was like 13 years old, and he hadn't really even finished fourth grade. Um, so there are people who are not getting the education they need, or at least weren't when I was homeschooling, and I don't imagine that that's completely changed since then. Um, and even those who are actually academically really engaged and super involved, some of the smartest kids I know, probably still believe in 6 day creationism, and it's like it's not the end of the world. It's not going to like cause a societal collapse or anything like that. But that kind of misinformation and that mistrust of the scientific method is the exact kind of thing that leads to people refusing to take the COVID vaccine. Those things, like, they have there's a domino effect that comes out of those things. You may look at something that I was taught as a kid and go, well, you figured it out. Or even if you still believed that, like, it's not going to affect your ability to live in society. But sometimes it does. Sometimes the things you were taught may not be exactly what messes you up now, but the same principles come into play, and you start to, you mistrust government programs, and therefore you start to spread misinformation that confirms the biases you were taught as a kid. Those kinds of things are a bigger concern for me.
Absolutely. I think the most poignant point you just made is like, when faith is taught as fact, what ends up happening, and this can only really happen in a homeschooled environment. Yeah, it can also happen in a private Christian schools environment for sure. But the exact line of thinking, what you're talking about, your perception, how you learn all these things that might not seem connected on the surface are absolutely connected. When you think, well, this is what I believe about God, precedes how I'm going to do the science experiment, how I'm going to read this history book, how I'm going to vote, how I'm going to do all these things. When that is the kind of brainwashing that does happen in white evangelical homes, eventually you do have to ask the question, wait, how much of this is actually legal? And
Yeah.
it does actually, sometimes it is borderline. There are a good handful of laws about homeschooling in the US, but a lot of them have nothing to do with religious things because of our First Amendment. Fine, okay, yeah, First Amendment for the most part, good thing. But where it gets kind of problematic is where we start to just permit an abusive structure. And so that's why I pose the question that way, because I don't have an easy answer to the question, obviously. I mean, it's a complicated question. But if we're going to say, okay, children are allowed to be educated at home, which we probably should, if for no other reason, to make sure we're not saying you have to be schooled through our government. We don't want to ever get there, because that is
We don't want to turn
not
the
good.
government into the biggest cult we can have.
Right. Exactly. But what we don't want to do is say you can do whatever you want with your kid at home in regards to education. Because what will end up happening is abuse and neglect. And just because it didn't happen to you when you were homeschooled does not mean it's not happening to literally thousands of kids right now.
No, it happened to people I knew.
Me too.
And I
Yep.
think most homeschoolers, most honest homeschoolers, can point out people they knew as kids in their social circles who were abused or part of abusive religious groups. Yeah, those are not isolated incidents. It's very common, if not the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Maybe one last question to try to kind of tie all this up. When you think about your home education experience, you and I were joking on the phone either day preparing for this episode about how, like, kind of with the joke that one of the things we were thankful for about being homeschooled is we got to explore everything that was wrong. So, like, since we believed everything that was wrong, we're able to critique it well now. And that's kind of a joke and maybe not like a smart thing to say when you really break it down. But at the end of the day, do you think like that education at home needs to be something that we're trying to spend more time refocusing on, that Christians should refocus on? Or should this be something we more say, hey, it's more stigmatized, more say home education is its own cult? Because, I like to just stigmatize Christianity and say, get out. And I think if you get out of Christianity, most of your homeschooling problems go away. But maybe I'm wrong on that. Do you think there's other ways to frame this conversation?
It's really complicated because there's so many moving parts. When you talk about a cult, like, yeah, get out, and then if you're still homeschooling, um, it's going to look different and maybe better. But homeschooling's issues on its own are different from Christianity's issues or evangelicals' issues. Like those, they're different. And where evangelicalism and homeschooling cross paths is where you get, and also I could say Catholicism too. That's pretty common. Catholicism and homeschooling can have some crossovers as well. You get some very interesting, hyper conservative Catholics in the homeschooled world. Those less my world, but I have read some interesting stories from people. And where those things kind of connect, where they coincide, and you have your religion, conservative religion, and homeschooling combined, like it's a recipe for real culty stuff. It's a recipe for indoctrination and a recipe for potentially abusive behavior, because homeschooling is more or less nothing more than a tool. You can use homeschooling to teach your kid critical thinking. You can use homeschooling to educate your child while traveling the world. There's a ton of different things you can use homeschooling for. It's just unfortunate that a large portion, I mean, if you look at the data, it's not a majority, but it is the largest group of people who homeschool do it for religious reasons. And I actually did, I saw the 35-36% statistic, but I also read a few places that in the United States specifically, the simple majority of homeschooled families do so for religious reasons. That if not their key reason, at least one of their reasons is
Right.
religion.
Yes.
And when you
Yeah,
factor
I was
that
going to
in,
chime in. I was going to chime in that it's almost always a fact. Majority wise, it was a factor. Yes, that's
I
correct.
did not know a single non-Christian homeschool family. I knew a Mormon homeschooling family, and that was the most different or out there in my world. There was every brand, but
Just
yeah,
anecdotally, I just want to chime in and say, like, I actually knew several non-Christian homeschoolers growing up. So it's totally a thing.
it is a thing.
But
And it's actually really funny because I remember reading blog posts from some homeschoolers who homeschool like parents who were like, why the heck can't I find any good curriculum? Everything I find is conservative Christian curriculum. And they're
that's
like,
an amazing point. Yeah.
yes, it was like I was reading the people who were writing a critique of the exact science curriculum that I used, and going like, why am I learning about, like, why is my kid being taught about hell um, in their biology book? Like we don't believe in this stuff, and but why we can't find anything. Like, this is what we found. This was one of the best that we found, and now I'm reading this stuff to my kid, like my kid's reading this, like, what is this about? Which I thought that was weird then, and now I think it's really funny. I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, that's what a problem to have.
Well, doesn't that point to how this how sorry, I'm gonna get in my own brand here. Um that shows you the power of the white evangelical cult, because it's like, wait a second. So according to one stat, not even the majority. According to another stat, well, maybe the majority at least considered them. How much power they must have to, at an institutional level, be influencing curriculum in a way that is so much less regulated.
Oh yeah.
That's a lot of power to wield.
Yeah. Well, and it's not the focus of this conversation, but like, we mentioned the Abeka curriculum at the beginning of this podcast, and that's not a homeschooling curriculum. It can be used for homeschooling, but it was actually designed for private schools. So that, opens things up even further. The evangelical cult has influenced curriculums of so many students, not just homeschoolers, but also people who attend private Christian schools. Yeah, it goes really deep, and it is incredibly powerful. Um, and I mean, I remember being told that I think I was told it was like a Hitler quote as a kid. Which now I'm like, what? Why were you quoting Hitler at me? I think that's kind of a weird thing to do. But they were saying like, well, you know what Hitler said? Like, give me control of the schools, and I'll give you or I have control of the culture, or something like that, right? Um, at no point did anybody try to point out like, that's exactly what we're doing. You know, they were saying like, this is why public
Absolutely.
schooling is bad. Public schooling is bad because giving government control of schools means that you'll end up just like the Nazis. And at no point did anybody want to point out like, well, we're just trying to get control of education instead for the exact same reason. They really believe
more than that. We're trying to get control of education to in order to make people think monolithically. Like that's
Yes.
like even more eerie, as it's like, you know, public schools teaching this whole evolution, which by the way, evolution is not a faith. Like it's not something like it's not a
No.
you know, it's not there's many different kinds of evolutionists, if that's the way you want to think about it, you weirdo Christians. There's like think of it as a lot of different denominations of evolutionists. Okay, like literally it's like it's this wide it's this method of evaluating the earth and evaluating species. It is not a belief in the same way that your Christianity is a belief, and so it's much more eerie to be like, yeah, get control of the schools, you'll control the culture. And I really wish they would teach the Bible in school. And it's like, wait a second. And they're not teaching
interpretation of the Bible, no less.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the even crazier part. So yeah, I mean, you and I are getting all worked up about this now, but but I do want to say, like, yes, it's a powerful thing. The numbers are staggering, and even beyond the numbers is just the principle of the thing. White evangelicals use home education to control and to contain people to their ways of thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more with that thesis.
Yep. Well, isn't that depressing? Chris,
how you feeling, John?
Yeah, I'm a little bummed out. You know, I've got my vodka next to me, so I think I'll be all right.
Good. Yeah, that's healthy.
Yeah.
Can't think about. I think I've got some right here too.
Okay.
We'll pour it middle of the afternoon. Little refresher after the conversations.
Before I'll edit this out if you want me to, Chris, but before we started recording, Chris said, ready to talk about homeschooling gives you alcoholism.
Oh yeah, no, I think that was, I thought that was hilarious. You better keep that in. Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah.
I'm proud of that quote.
That's the simplest point is don't homeschool your kids or they'll get alcoholism.
Yeah, there's tons of scientific data behind that one for sure. That's not anecdotal.
A lot of this was anecdotal, so we'll just throw some more onto it.
We'll just keep throwing anecdotes into this.
Chris, it's always fun to have you on. Last time you told people not to vote for garbage people. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, delete your social media. Just delete it. You won't regret it. That's my plug for today. My plugs are instead of plugging things, I'm just giving people vaguely good advice. And today's hot take: delete your social media. Just don't use it anymore. I haven't deleted my accounts yet, but I have deleted it from my phone over a year. Great thing. I recommend everybody does it. Social media is a trap.
Wow, I love it.
And now I'm going to start a cult.
So if you want to follow my Instagram, it's but I will say that well, first off, yeah, I mean I'm on all the social media. A lot of it's for you know, promoting this stupid podcast. But what I will say for those of you who are like, Chris is a radical, I don't want to delete my social media. I have timers on my apps. Like seriously, like I have a 1 hour. I have a 1 hour timer on Instagram and a 2 hour on Facebook. And I rarely ever use the full time just because I know I have those timers on it.
It will change your life. Getting rid of that like time eating, even if it's just like limiting your time. It will give you so much more time to do other things and discover things that you care about.
Awesome. Great. Well, again, it was great to have you on, Chris. I'm sure I'll have you back on. And thank you, listener, for stopping by. If you wish to learn more about what's going on in my life or wish to purchase my book, go to vernerbooks.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, please continue to listen, follow, share, and consider supporting through the link in the show's notes. For as little as 99 cents a month, you can help me book guests, upgrade my production value, and start exciting projects. Thank you for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.